Hello, I'm Matt Donnelly. It's Friday night, so that means it's time for the Fantasy Points Friday Night Hype Show. As always, I'm going to take you through my mind as we head into this weekend slate of games. And you know what? Going through my head is a very dangerous place, especially after 3 or 4 coffees. Now, we are going to preview Minnesota versus Buffalo, Cleveland versus Miami, Detroit versus Chicago, and the Los Angeles Chargers as they take on the San Francisco 49ers. But before we get into this week's slate of games, we have to talk about some of the notable injuries from around the league, starting with Aaron Jones. He had that low ankle injury there. Tests were negative. Chances are he's going to be available this week. Romeo Doubs, on the other hand, high ankle sprain. We're looking at 4 to 6 weeks. Don't expect him in your lineup anytime soon. Josh Allen, probably the biggest name there in fantasy football. He has that UCL injury there. He hadn't logged to practice up until Thursday. This is going to be a game time type decision there. We may get Case Keenum, and you know what? Maybe Josh Allen sucks up and gets in there, but I'm having a feeling that even if he plays, he's not going to be nearly as effective. Now, we've also got Deion Jackson. He had that hyperextension of the knee. There was a chance that he could play, but as of Thursday, he had been downgraded. Mike Evans, he's got the ribs. He's in Munich, Germany right now. This is going to be a pain tolerance type thing, so expect him to be in that lineup. Kyler Murray, hamstrung, whatever you want to call it. He's trending like he's going to play, but something to monitor as we head throughout the rest of this week. Matthew Stafford, on the other hand, he has been put in concussion protocol, which really puts his game this week in doubt. We've also got Jonathan Taylor. Now, Colts fans, I get it. Things have been getting weird in Indianapolis. Jonathan Taylor looks like he's going to play this week. He logged a full practice here on Thursday, so the expectation is he's going to suit up against the Raiders. DeAndre Swift, he's going to continue that workload management there. Keenan Allen, another one of those guys who's been battling a hamstring. Look, between him and Darren Waller, who we're going to talk about here in a second, the older you get, those hamstrings, they don't quite heal the same way. So is he going to be available this week? I don't know. Something you have to monitor ahead of Thursday's contests. We've also got Ezekiel Elliott there. He has a knee injury. He was limited in practice this week. Looks like he's going to have a knee brace, and he's going to be good to go on Sunday. And finally, I mentioned Darren Waller there. He's got that hamstring. He has now been placed on the IR, as well as Hunter Renfrow with an oblique injury, also headed the IR for the Las Vegas Raiders. With that all being said, make sure that you are checking in with Fantasy Points' very own Edwin Porras there and the Fantasy Points podcast for all your injury updates ahead of Week 10's action. Now let's talk about some of these other games that I'm not quite as excited about, but definitely have all kinds of fantasy implications. Starting with Seattle versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers there in Munich, Germany. Congratulations, Tom Brady, on 100,000 yards passing. Does that mean Giselle gets credit for 50,000 of those? You know what? Never mind. You know what? Next game here. Now, Jacksonville at the Kansas City Chiefs. Fun fact, Patrick Mahomes became the first player in Super Bowl era with at least 400 yards passing, 60 yards rushing, and a rushing score. Then again, hey, it's not hard to throw for 400 yards when you throw 68 times. Can the Chiefs slow down Travis Etienne, who since week number 6 leads the NFL in rushing yards with 465 and missed tackles forced with 26, while averaging the second most yards per game at 6.1. Next up, we have the Houston Texans at the New York Giants. Saquon Barkley against the worst run defense in the NFL. What could go wrong? Houston will need Dameon Pierce to control the clock to keep the Texans in this contest, much like they were able to do against the Eagles. New Orleans at Pittsburgh. Listen, I'm still trying to find out if this is fact or fiction because the Steelers' inability to score a touchdown from outside the red zone seems crazy to me. But it's a fact. They haven't scored from outside the 20-yard line. While their opponents, their opposition here, has scored 9 times, which is the most in the NFL. If Kenny Pickett wants to crack the top 20 as far as fantasy is concerned amongst quarterbacks for the first time as a starter, he's going to need some splash plays. And you know what? George Pickens this week on Paulson and Adebo, this looks like a good matchup. On a side note, a little pony told me that we could see Jalen Warren there get a little bit more action this week and a little less Najee Harris. Make of that what you will. Fact or fiction? You tell me. Now, Denver at Tennessee. Can the Broncos slow down Derrick Henry, which is something no other team has seemingly been able to do, who is now the 5th running back in NFL history to have 17 or more games with 100-plus rushing yards and multiple touchdowns in their first 7 seasons? Can Russell Wilson and the Broncos pass game get things going against a struggling Titans secondary? I'm talking about you, Jerry Jeudy, on Roger McCreary. Indianapolis at Las Vegas. My sanity and my fandom is on the line this week. If the Raiders blow a 4th 17-point lead against a team whose coach is calling plays for the very first time. I mean, I'm done. I quit. It's out. It's over. Now, Dallas at Green Bay. I don't exactly remember the plot of Legends of the Fall, but I can't help but think that it had something to do with Micah Parsons drilling Aaron Rodgers multiple times. 2021 Dallas Cowboys defense, through the first 8 games, they had 16 sacks and 14 takeaways. The 2022 version of this Dallas Cowboys defense, through 8 games, 33 sacks, 13 takeaways. Now for Arizona at the Los Angeles Rams. Could this be the battle of the backups? Colt McCoy versus John Wolford? That actually sounds like some sort of tombstone gunfight there from Wyatt Earp type stuff. Now keep an eye on the injury reports in this one, because we've seen both Matthew Stafford and Kyler Murray on that injury report, and things could change, but they might not. And finally, the Monday Night Football game. We have the Washington Commanders heading to Philadelphia to take on the Philadelphia Eagles. It's hard not to look ahead for the Philadelphia Eagles, but Philadelphia is the 29th team to start 8-0, and the previous 28 teams all made the playoffs, with 15 of them winning their conference and 8 of them winning the Super Bowl. Now, not to get lost in all this Eagle streak stuff, but Jalen Hurts has now won 11 consecutive starts as a starter in Philadelphia. Those who are wondering who's on bye, who's not, Baltimore, Cincinnati, New England, and the New York Jets, Jets. Bye. Now let's dive into our games of the week here. The games I am excited to talk about, and they involve, first off, Minnesota at Buffalo. The Minnesota Vikings, Kirk Cousins is the NFL version of Vanilla Ice. Ice, baby. You like that? AKA Kirk Thuggins representing. Here's your weekly reminder that you are witnessing something special that you didn't even know that you were seeing. NFL's all-time consecutive games with a touchdown. Number 1, Drew Brees, 54 from 2009 and 2012. Tom Brady, 52, 2010 to 2013. Peyton Manning, 51 consecutive games, 2010 to 2014. Johnny Unitas, 47 consecutive games, 56 through 1960. Drew Brees, again, from 2012 to 2015, did it 45 times, and at number 6 right now with a 38-game streak himself, dating back to 2020, is the one and only Kirk Cousins. Randy Moss, Odell Beckham Jr., and now Justin Jefferson are the only receivers to record 19 career games of 100 or more receiving yards within their first 3 NFL seasons, after Jefferson caught 7 of 13 targets last week for 115 yards. Now, per Scott Barrett on this week's XFP report over on fantasypoints.com, and I quote, "I am open to the idea that TJ Hawkinson might already be Minnesota's true wide receiver too. For one thing, his week 9 usage was excellent. Despite spending only 4 full days with the team, he ran a route on 81% of the team's dropbacks in week number 9, which was a season high, turning 9 targets and a 23.1% target share, second most on the team, into 9 catches for 70 yards. For another thing, that's as many targets and only 2 receiving yards off of Adam Thielen's season best figures." Something to kind of put in your pipe there for now. Now, Buffalo, they may not be the city of brotherly love, but we do have a reunion of sorts, as James Cook will be hosting Big Brother Delvin this week. Last week, the older Cook led all backs in snap rate there at 89%, but the production versus the Commanders, it simply wasn't there. It wasn't the greatest, as he was held to just 47 yards on 17 attempts. Normally, I would say fade Dalvin Cook against this tough Bills defense, this tough Bills front. But I'm old enough to remember last week when Michael Carter and James Robinson combined for 124 yards on 25 carries, which works out to almost 5 yards per attempt. Now, for the Buffalo Bills, the biggest news out of Buffalo pertains to that throwing elbow of one Josh Allen. As of right now, we don't know if he's going to miss time. We don't know if he's going to play, but for ordinary mortals, you can expect a several-week hiatus in order to properly recover. That said, Allen is far from ordinary, as the very next play after injuring said elbow, he ended up chucking a 70-yard bomb to Gabe Davis that he happened to drop, but that's neither here nor there. If Allen were to miss time and Case Keenum was forced into action, then there would be a fantasy rippling effect here taking place across most of your fantasy leagues. We all want a piece of this Bills offense, but that's only because Josh Allen makes this thing come together. That said, never underestimate the power of a revenge game, as both Case Keenum and Stephon Diggs get a visit from their old squad from Minnesota. To date, Stephon Diggs is averaging the 14th most fantasy points per game this season and has been fortunate enough to turn his time with Allen into 23.5 fantasy points per contest while averaging a 30% target share over the last 4 weeks. Meanwhile, Gabriel Davis has just one game in the last 4 weeks with a target share greater than 20%. How would you just catch the ball? We won't have to worry about this. Now, let's try not to forget what Stephon Diggs and Case Keenum were able to do, that connection they had in Minnesota. If you look at Stephon Diggs and his best statistical games to date, right near the top is a 173-yard performance back in 2017 when Case Keenum was under center. Let's not forget about the Minneapolis Miracle where Diggs and Keenum connected for that 61-yard passing catch and walked off a playoff victory against the New Orleans Saints. Gabriel Davis just needs to catch the damn ball. He has been a boomer bust play for fantasy all season long, where he's got about 3 games in which he's had at least 16 or more fantasy points, but he's also got 4 games where he has 7 or fewer fantasy points. He's been giving owners too many ups, too many downs, with his last real usable game going all the way back to week number 6. He has been limited to just 4 catches and 68 receiving yards on 12 targets in the last 2 games. And he's had matchups, though, against Jair Alexander, Sauce Gardner, and DJ Reed. And by the way, I love those corners from the New York Jets. And that's all per this week's Fantasy Points Market Report that you can get over on fantasypoints.com. In theory, Davis versus Patrick Peterson and Stephon Diggs versus Caleb Evans are receiver cornerback matchups that favor the Bills drastically. You could take a deeper look at this and more wide receiver cornerback matchups courtesy of Scott Baird on this week's Week 10 wide receiver cornerback matchup report. Looking for another game report? Let's report to Miami, where the Cleveland Browns are heading to Miami to take on the Dolphins. Miami, they are allowing the 10th most fantasy points per game to receivers this season at 35.32, and the most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks this season at 22.3. And Jacoby Brissett, he's getting himself a revenge game, and you know how much I love that narrative. I'm not expecting a huge week from Jacoby Brissett, but you have to think that Amari Cooper could be in line for a top 5 fantasy week at the wide receiver position. Look, Xavier Howard, he once was great. He literally had about a 47.7% passer rating there last season. This year, he is clearly over 100. So him in coverage is going to be favor, advantage, whatever you want to call it, to Cooper and company. Now look for Xavier Howard to be in coverage on Cooper most of the game. And the last time that Howard and Cooper faced off, Cooper was a Cowboy, and he had 2 touchdowns and 88 yards on 6 receptions. Now, per Jacob Gibbs there, at JA_Gibbs_23 on Twitter, the Dolphins rank top 5 in both man coverage and blitz rate. Amari Cooper versus the blitz, 38% target per route run rate, which is 3rd in the NFL, and 4.58 yards per route run, which is tops. Amari Cooper versus man coverage, 36% target per route run rate, which is 4th, and 3.03 yards per route run. Again, everything here I'm just saying is lining up for Cooper to have a big game. Look, Brissett, he is playing with house money right now. Deshaun Watson, he's set to return from suspension in just a couple weeks, and Brissett has nothing to lose. Brissett has been solid in getting the most out of guys like David Njoku, as more than any other Browns quarterback in recent memory has been able to do. He's also shown a chemistry with both Cooper and Donovan Peoples-Jones, which is a good reason why he's had 5 consecutive weeks in which he's posted more than 15 fantasy points. Now, Nick Chubb, he has been one of the more dominating backs all season long, ranking 2nd in rushing yards with 841 and doing this on just 149 carries. Derrick Henry, he leads the league with 870, and he had to do that with 29 more attempts. Chubb leads Henry 10-9, as well as the rest of the league in rushing touchdowns there, thanks in part to capitalizing on his 25, which is the 3rd most, carries inside the red zone that has resulted in 8 of those 10 scores. For Miami, listen, I love talking about the Dolphins. I'm not even going to hide that fact right now. I love this Dolphins team. Tyreek Hill now has 1,104 receiving yards this season, which is 291 more than Cooper Kupp, who sits 2nd in the NFL. Those 1,104 yards are more than Calvin Johnson had in his first 9 games of the 2023 season, which had been the previous high receiving mark in the Super Bowl era over a 9-game stretch. Heck, those 1,104 receiving yards are more than the receivers have in Dallas, Pittsburgh, Atlanta, Houston, New York, that's the Giants, Chicago, Baltimore, and Tennessee. There is a real possibility that Hill could become the first 2,000-yard receiver in NFL history. Calvin Johnson's record there of 1,964 yards is clearly in jeopardy at this time. Why? Because Tua Tagovailoa, he continues to impress. he became the first Dolphins quarterback to post consecutive games of 300 passing yards with 3 or more touchdowns and no interceptions. Eat your heart out, Dan Marino. Not impressed yet? How about some more stats and facts, as Tagovailoa also ranks first in yards per attempt this season, 9.2, passer rating at 115.9. Crazier yet, he is on pace to become just the 4th quarterback in NFL history to attempt 400 or more passes and finish with a passer rating greater than 115 and average 9 yards per attempt. The other quarterbacks to accomplish this feat, they all won the NFL MVP in the years that they did this. Peyton Manning, Aaron Rodgers, and Matt Ryan. As impressive as Hill has been, he produced all these fancy stats, all these big-time numbers, with a running back who's just as good as any other receiver in the game. Jalen Waddle has been doing his thing as well this season. Waddle, he sits 5th in fantasy points this season with 163.9, while sitting 10th in fantasy points per game with 18.2. But when Tagovailoa is under center, Waddle sees a jump in production, averaging 2.9 yards per route run and 24 fantasy points per game. As for Tyreek Hill, with Tua Tagovailoa under center, he's getting 26.3 fantasy points per game in the 5 full starts, which would be the all-time high. Previously was 26.2, set by Jerry Rice back in 1987. You want to start Waddle and Hill every week without a question, and this week in particular, it gets even better. Looking at Joe Dolan's matchup report over on fantasypoints.com. And here we go, air quotations and everything. Over the past 5 weeks, Martin Emerson is 4th among qualified cornerbacks in FP coverage snaps allowed at 0.43. And Emerson, he hasn't even played since week 5. And while Denzel Ward is expected back, Ward's traditionally been a good player. But over the last 5 weeks of this season, his 0.47 FP per coverage snaps, they were the most among all qualified corners. Ward gave up more than 50 yards receiving in primary coverage to 4 different receivers prior to getting injured. Those receivers, Mike Williams, Deontay Johnson, Corey Davis, and Garrett Wilson, which basically went for a touchdown, 58 yards on 3 targets. I haven't even talked about Jeffrey Wilson. That's going to have to wait until next week, because you know I'm going to talk about the Dolphins again in week number 11. Now, Detroit at Chicago. Look, I know the rules. You don't go chasing waterfalls, and you never go chasing fantasy points. But this week's Lions versus Bears NFC showdown here has potential to be the highest scoring game of the week, with fantasy points being handed out at a higher rate than Raiders L's while leading by 17. For Detroit, believe it or not, sometimes stats are misleading. Last week, Amon-Ra St. Brown caught 4 passes for 55 yards, and you would think that is not worthy of wide receiver consideration, especially when we're building against the top wide receivers in the game today. But here are the numbers inside the numbers. St. Brown was targeted on 7 occasions, meaning he commanded 38% target share while running a route on 100% of Jared Goff's dropbacks against the Packers. This season, the Bears, they sit 12th in fantasy points against opposing wide receivers and have allowed 1,287 yards, which is the 13th most, and 6 touchdowns, which is the 6th fewest. Now, I'm going to talk about St. Brown in just a second, but I'm going to keep on this whole brother thing. James Cook versus Dalvin Cook isn't the only brother versus brother matchup on the docket this week. Amon-Ra St. Brown, he comes to Chicago to visit his big brother there, Equanimous. Now, I need a fact checker or something to tell me the last time that 2 sets of brothers faced off on the same day in the NFL. Now, St. Brown, if you're looking for matchups inside the matchups, he's got a really good one against Kyler Gordon this week, who's going to be drawing the assignment and coverage. Gordon has been absolutely atrocious, giving up more yards to receivers than any other cornerback in the game. Gordon is allowing 0.31 fantasy points per route run, and we know that St. Brown is going to run them routes. St. Brown, whether it's due to injuries or whatnot, he's been held to 8 or less catches in 5 straight contests this season after recording 8 or more receptions in 8 straight games. Our very own Edwin Porras talked earlier this week on Swift and likely how he suffered a high ankle injury, a problem he has struggled with dating back to high school. And until we see Swift is off the injury report for multiple weeks in a row, we really can't trust him as much more than a flex play. Now, I'm okay plugging both Jamal Williams and DeAndre Swift in as a flex if you're looking for that flexual healing for your roster, especially with these bye weeks. But don't give up on Swift yet, because if we're looking ahead, he's got both the Panthers and the Bears during your fantasy playoffs. For Chicago, Look, I love talking about Chicago now. They're a fun team to talk about. Chicago was a non-call away from knocking off the Dolphins last week, thanks in part to Justin Fields fully unleashing his Konami Code cheat abilities as he ran for more yards than any other quarterback in NFL history in the regular season, tearing apart the Dolphins defense for 178 yards on 15 attempts. Michael Vick had previously established the previous high of 173 rushing yards back in 2002, and I think Colin Kaepernick has the all-time record in that playoff game. Now, Fields also added 3 touchdowns with his arms to go along with that one rushing score. Fields is also the first player since 1950 to have run for more than 150 yards and throw for 3 touchdowns. The next closest comparison is actually Walter Payton, who had 150 yards rushing and 2 passing touchdowns. Now, over the last 4 weeks, Fields leads all players, that's right, players, not just quarterbacks, players in fantasy points with 110.52. Chicago, they're still going to be a run-first team. We know about Justin Fields, David Montgomery, Khalil Herbert. This season, the Bears are averaging 195.4 yards on the ground per game, but over the last 4 contests, the Bears are averaging 225 yards on the ground. That is something that has not been done since the 1976 Pittsburgh Steelers. All those yards on the ground and the threat of Fields taking off are starting to open things up in the passing game. Funny how using a mobile quarterback to his best attributes can actually pay off for an offense. Did I mention that the Lions have already allowed 1,190 yards on the ground this season, which works out to about 148.8 yards per game, which is also the second most in the league behind just the Houston Texans? Yeah, the math, if you do it there, it's not great. Now, expect more Chase Claypool coming this week. The addition of Claypool not only opened up things for Cole Kmet last week, but also allowed Darnell Mooney to play more of that vertical slot role for the Bears, which is pretty tough to defend. While Claypool only caught 2 passes for 16 yards, he did see 6 targets on 16 routes run, meaning he is being targeted on 38% of his routes. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but this Bears offense may very well be ready to fully unleash the beast. Let's turn our attention to the primetime lights as the Los Angeles Chargers head to San Francisco to take on the 49ers. Eckler versus McCaffrey, 2 of the best pass-catching receiving backs going head-to-head under those primetime lights. Get your popcorn ready. It's Sunday Night Football. The Los Angeles Chargers, Austin Eckler is the captain now. Last season, Austin Eckler had a rushing touchdown and a touchdown catch in 4 games. That was the 10th time a player had done that in a full season. He's now done that in 4 of the past 5 games this season. In 32 games Eckler has played with Justin Herbert under center, he now has 33 touchdowns. Yeah, you heard that right. I may have been wrong thinking that touchdown regression was on its way for Eckler, so I will eat the L on that one. Once again, referencing Scott Barrett's XFP report, which you can go and see over there on fantasypoints.com, Eckler leads all players at all positions in XFP per game. They're 21.2 and fantasy points per game at 25. And it's almost a scary thought, but there is still some untapped potential here. Through the first 5 weeks of the season, Eckler only handled 56% of the team's backfield XFP, which is the 20th most, with a high of only 62%. Since then, he has seen 75%, which is the 12th most, 86%, the second most, and then last week, 81%, which was the 5th most of a team's backfield XFP. Now, all that has been needed from this Chargers offense as Keenan Allen has missed a majority of the season and Mike Williams has been absent the last couple weeks due to injury. Looking at Graham Barfield's stat pack on fantasypoints.com, Justin Herbert averages 17% more fantasy production while Keenan Allen suits up 21.6 fantasy points per game versus 18.5. If Allen is to miss time again this week and things are not trending in the right direction, at least not right now, then someone other than Austin Eckler has to step up, and that likely means Josh Palmer is the most likely candidate. Again, looking at that stat pack, Palmer has been targeted 8 or more times in 4 games in which he has been healthy and playing 80% of the snaps, with his worst fantasy performance coming as the wide receiver 32 and his best performance coming as the wide receiver 10. If you are looking for a sleeper play this week, how about DeAndre Carter working out a slot against Jimmy Ward? Ward is allowing 0.29 fantasy points per route run this season, and if Allen and Williams are missing, there could be a volume play at hand here. And finally, the San Francisco 49ers, I was on our weekly show this week touting Jimmy Garoppolo as a top 10 fantasy option the rest of the season. And thanks to having one of the easiest fantasy schedules over the back half of the season, as well as some of the best fantasy weapons at his disposal, I think it's very plausible. Deebo Samuel, Christian McCaffrey, Brandon Ayuk, and George Kittle, that's not a bad group of people to be throwing the ball to. Unfortunately, for fantasy managers, one of those options is going to get the fantasy squeeze each and every week. And I don't think we're going to know who it is, but I can guarantee you it's not going to be Christian McCaffrey. Garoppolo has posted 70.5 fantasy points with 2 or more passing touchdowns in each of the last 4 contests, and he's done that with Deebo Samuel missing for a couple of those games. Good news is Deebo Samuel, he was spotted in practice this week, so he should be returning to the lineup here on Sunday night. Meanwhile, Elijah Mitchell, he's designated to return from the IR on Monday, and he could provide some additional depth behind Christian McCaffrey. Now, Ayuk has been playing some inspired ball himself this season, and he has had success even with Deebo Samuel in the lineup on the field opposite of him. That said, if you look at Ayuk's fantasy splits and production with and without Samuel, there is a noticeable uptick with Samuel cannot dress. In the last 7 games without Samuel in the lineup, Ayuk has averaged 8.4 targets per game versus 6 targets while he's there. And then you look at the fantasy production, 19.5 fantasy points in 5 of those 7 contests. The 49ers, they had a bye week last week. So the last time that we saw Christian McCaffrey suit up in the red and gold, he became the first player since 2005 with a passing, a rushing, and a receiving touchdown in a single game. He's basically our generation's LaDainian Tomlinson. Now, McCaffrey will once again be a cheat code for fantasy managers this week against the Chargers, who have allowed the second most fantasy points per game to this position, allowing 30.08 per contest. They've also allowed the 3rd most yards on the ground at 1,073 and the 5th most rushing touchdowns with 9. And to my fellow Vipercast hosts, yes, I'm looking at you, Tara. I'm looking at you, Major. Jimmy Garoppolo finishing as a top 10 fantasy quarterback from weeks 10 to 17 is a much bolder take than Christian McCaffrey finishing as the RB1. There's a Twitter poll that proves it. Now you've heard from me. I want to hear from you. What are the games, the matchups, and the headlines that you are looking forward to this week? What games do you want me to feature next week? Drop them in the comments below because we want to hear from you. And another way to hear from you is by signing up at fantasypoints.com, and we'll give you 10% off if you use promo code HYPE22. That's right, promo code HYPE22, HYPE22. That's going to get you 10% off that Fantasy Points subscription. We got all kinds of packages to help you score more. But before I let you go this week, let's talk about some of the shows that you can catch on the Fantasy Points YouTube channel, starting on Mondays with the Monday Grades with Wes Huber at 9 a.m. Eastern. Tuesdays, Plugged In DFS Review, Scott Barrett and Jordan Tolling, 2 p.m. Eastern. Wednesday, we got the midweek mailbag there, courtesy of Nick Script, and the daily lineup with Joe Dolan every Tuesday to Friday, 9 a.m. Eastern. You do not want to miss that. And to close out the show, we have our quote of the week, courtesy of Jim Irsay. I don't know how to make sausage. I don't know what goes into sausage, but I do know how to build a football team. I've been doing it for 50 plus years. Don't worry, Jim. I know how to make sausage. I know what goes into sausage. And just like the team over at fantasypoints.com, we know how to win fantasy championships. So if you're looking to score more, head to fantasypoints.com today. Tell them Matt sent you. And finally, I just want to close out this with my own little touch to the show. Today, as we should every day, we should remember those who volunteered, sacrificed, served, fought, and died for our freedoms. We thank you and we salute you as we salute those who made the ultimate sacrifice for our freedoms. We shall never forget.